Tragedy is a form of drama based on human suffering that invokes an accompanying catharsis or pleasure in audiences. While many cultures have developed forms that provoke this paradoxical response, the term tragedy often refers to a specific tradition of drama that has played a unique and important role historically in the self-definition of Western civilization. That tradition has been multiple and discontinuous, yet the term has often been used to invoke a powerful effective cultural identity and historical continuity. The Greeks and the Elizabethans, in one cultural form, Hellenes and Christians, in a common activity, as Raymond Williams puts it, from its origins in the theatre of ancient Greece 2,500 years ago, from which there survives only a fraction of the work of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, through its singular articulations in the works of Shakespeare, Lope de Vega, Jean Racine, and Friedrich Schiller, to the more recent naturalistic tragedy of August Strindberg, Samuel Beckett's modernist meditations on death, loss and suffering, Muller's postmodernist reworkings of the tragic canon, and Joshua Oppenheimer's incorporation of tragic pathos in his non-fiction film. The act of killing, tragedy, has remained an important site of cultural experimentation, negotiation, struggle, and change. A long line of philosophers, which includes Plato, Aristotle, Saint Augustine, Voltaire, Hume, Diderot, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Freud, Benjamin, Camus, Lacan, and Deleuze, have analyzed, speculated upon, and criticized the genre. In the wake of Aristotle's Poetics, tragedy has been used to make genre distinctions, whether at the scale of poetry in general or at the scale of the drama. In the modern era, tragedy has also been defined against drama, melodrama, the tragicomic, and epic theatre. Drama, in the narrow sense, cuts across the traditional division between comedy and tragedy in an anti- or a generic deterritorialization from the mid-19th century onwards. Both Bertolt Brecht and Augusto Bold define their epic theatre projects against models of tragedy. Taxido, however, reads epic theatre as an incorporation of tragic functions in its treatments of mourning and speculation. Origin. The word tragedy appears to have been used to describe different phenomena at different times. It derives from classical Greek tau rho alpha gamma delta iota alpha, contracted from tragaudia equals goat song, which comes from tragos equals he goat, and eridine equals to sing. Scholars suspect this may be traced to a time when the goat was either the prize in a competition of choral dancing or was that around which a chorus danced prior to the animal's ritual sacrifice. In another view on the etymology, Athenaeus of Naucratis says that the original form of the word was trigodia from trigus, an ode, because those events were first introduced during grape harvest. Writing in 335 BCE, Aristotle provides the earliest surviving explanation for the origin of the dramatic art form in his Poetics, in which he argues that tragedy developed from the improvisations of the leader of choral dithyrambs. Anyway, arising from an improvisatory beginning, tragedy grew little by little, as the poets developed whatever new part of it had appeared, and, passing through many changes, tragedy came to a halt, since it had attained its own nature. Poetics IV 1449a 10-15. In the same work, Aristotle attempts to provide a scholastic definition of what tragedy is. Tragedy is, then, an enactment of a deed that is important and complete, and of a certain magnitude, by means of language enriched with ornaments, each used separately in the different parts of the play. It is enacted, not merely recited, and through pity and fear it effects relief to such, and similar, emotions. Poetics, by 1449b 2-3. There is some dissent to the dithyrambic origins of tragedy, mostly based on the differences between the shapes of their choruses and styles of dancing. A common descent from pre-Hellenic fertility and burial rites has been suggested. Friedrich Nietzsche discussed the origins of Greek tragedy in his early book The Birth of Tragedy. Here, he suggests the name originates in the use of a chorus of goat-like satyrs in the original dithyrambs from which the tragic genre developed. Scott Scullion writes, "There is abundant evidence for tragoidia understood as song for the prize goat. The best-known evidence is Horace, Ars Poetica 220-24. The earliest is the Parian Marble, a chronicle inscribed about 264–63 BCE, which records, under a date between 538 and 528 BCE. Thespes is the poet first produced, and as prize was established the billy goat. The clearest is Eustathius 1769.45. They called those competing tragedians, clearly because of the song over the billy goat. Greek tragedy. Athenian tragedy, the oldest surviving form of tragedy, is a type of dance drama that formed an important part of the theatrical culture of the city-state. Having emerged sometime during the 6th century BCE, it flowered during the 5th century BCE, and continued to be popular until the beginning of the Hellenistic period. No tragedies from the 6th century, and only 32 of the more than 1,000 that were performed in the 5th century, have survived. We have complete texts extant by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Athenian tragedies were performed in late March, early April at an annual state religious festival in honor of Dionysus. The presentations took the form of a contest between 3 playwrights, who presented their works on 3 successive days. Each playwright offered a tetralogy consisting of 3 tragedies and a concluding comic piece called a satyr play. The 4 plays sometimes featured linked stories. Only one complete trilogy of tragedies has survived, the Orestia of Aeschylus. The Greek theatre was in the open air, on the side of a hill, and performances of a trilogy and satyr play probably lasted most of the day. Performances were apparently open to all citizens, including women, but evidence is scant. The theatre of Dionysus at Athens probably held around 12,000 people. All of the choral parts were sung, and some of the actors' answers to the chorus were sung as well. The play as a whole was composed in various verse meters. All actors were male and wore masks. A Greek chorus danced as well as sang, though no one knows exactly what sorts of steps the chorus performed as it sang. Choral songs in tragedy are often divided into 3 sections: strophe, antistrophe, and epode. Many ancient Greek tragedians employed the echikalme as a theatrical device, which was a platform hidden behind the scene that could be rolled out to display the aftermath of some event which had happened out of sight of the audience. This event was frequently a brutal murder of some sort, an act of violence which could not be effectively portrayed visually, but an action of which the other characters must see the effects in order for it to have meaning and emotional resonance. A prime example of the use of the echikalme is after the murder of Agamemnon in the first play of Aeschylus or Orestia, when the king's butchered body is wheeled out in a grand display for all to see. Variations on the echikalme are used in tragedies and other forms to this day, as writers still find it a useful and often powerful device for showing the consequences of extreme human actions. Another such device was a crane, the mechana, which served to hoist a god or goddess on stage when they were supposed to arrive flying. This device gave origin to the phrase deus ex machina, that is, the surprise intervention of an unforeseen external factor that changes the outcome of an event. Roman tragedy. Following the expansion of the Roman Republic into several Greek territories between 270–240 BCE, Rome encountered Greek tragedy. From the later years of the Republic and by means of the Roman Empire, theatre spread west across Europe, around the Mediterranean, and even reached England. While Greek tragedy continued to be performed throughout the Roman period, the year 240 BCE marks the beginning of regular Roman drama. Livius Andronicus began to write Roman tragedies, thus creating some of the first important works of Roman literature. 5 years later, Gnaeus Naevius also began to write tragedies. No complete early Roman tragedy survives. Though it was highly regarded in its day, historians know of three other early tragic playwrights, Quintus Ennius, Marcus Pacuvius and Lucius Accius. From the time of the Empire, the tragedies of two playwrights survive. One is an unknown author, while the other is the Stoic philosopher Seneca. 9 of Seneca's tragedies survive, all of which are fabula crepidata. His Phaedra, for example, was based on Euripides' Hippolytus. Historians do not know who wrote the only extant example of the fabula praetexta, Octavia, but in former times it was mistakenly attributed to Seneca due to his appearance as a character in the tragedy. Seneca's tragedies rework those of all three of the Athenian tragic playwrights whose work has survived. Probably meant to be recited at elite gatherings, they differ from the Greek versions in their long declamatory, narrative accounts of action, their obtrusive moralizing, and the bombastic rhetoric. They dwell on detailed accounts of horrible deeds and contain long reflective soliloquies. Though the gods rarely appear in these plays, ghosts and witches abound. Senecan tragedies explore ideas of revenge, the occult, the supernatural, suicide, blood and gore. The Renaissance scholar Julius Caesar Scaliger, who knew both Latin and Greek, preferred Seneca to Euripides. Renaissance tragedy. Influence of Greek and Roman tragedy. Classical Greek drama was largely forgotten in Western Europe from the Middle Ages to the beginning of the 16th century. Medieval theatre was dominated by mystery plays, morality plays, farces and miracle plays. In Italy, the models for tragedy in the later Middle Ages were Roman, particularly the works of Seneca, interest in which was reawakened by the Paduan Lavato da Lavati. His pupil Albertino Mussato, also of Padua, in 1315 wrote the Latin verse tragedy Ex Renes, which uses the story of the tyrant his Eleanor III da Romano to highlight the danger to Padua posed by Count Grande della Scala of Verona. It was the first secular tragedy written since Roman times, and may be considered the first Italian tragedy identifiable as a Renaissance work. The Casu Caesani, a contemporary account in Latin prose by Lodovico da Fabriano of Perugia of the sack in February 1377 of the city of Cesena and the massacre of its inhabitants by Breton mercenaries led by Giovanni Acuto, under the command of Robert, Cardinal of Geneva, is entitled Tragedy, by some copyists. The earliest tragedies to employ purely classical themes are the Achilles written before 1390 by Antonio Loschi of Vicenza and the Progna of the Venetian Gregorio Corro, which dates from 1428 to 29. In 1515 Gian Giorgio Trissino of Vicenza wrote his tragedy Sophona's Bar in the vernacular that would later be called Italian. Drawn from Livy's account of Sophona's Bar, the Carthaginian princess who drank poison to avoid being taken by the Romans. It adheres closely to classical rules. It was soon followed by the Arreste in Rosmunda of Trissino's friend, the Florentine Giovanni di Bernardo Rucellai. Both were completed by early 1516 and are based on classical Greek models, Rosmunda on the Hecuba of Euripides, and Arreste on the Iphigenia in Taurus of the same author. Like Sophona's Bar, they are in Italian and in blank hendecasyllables. Although these three are often cited, separately or together, as being the first regular tragedies in modern times, Pamphila or Philostrato e Pamphila written in 1498 or 1508 by Antonio Camilli, and a Sophona's Bar by Galeotto del Carota of 1502. From about 1500 printed copies, in the original languages, of the works of Sophocles, Seneca, and Euripides, as well as comedic writers such as Aristophanes, Terence and Plautus, were available in Europe, and the next 40 years saw humanists and poets translating and adapting their tragedies. In the 1540s, the European university setting became host to a Neo-Latin theatre written by scholars. The influence of Seneca was particularly strong in its humanist tragedy. His plays, with their ghosts, lyrical passages and rhetorical oratory, brought a concentration on rhetoric and language over dramatic action to many humanist tragedies. The most important sources for French tragic theatre in the Renaissance were the example of Seneca and the precepts of Horace and Aristotle, although plots were taken from classical authors such as Plutarch, Suetonius, etc., from the Bible, from contemporary events and from short story collections. The Greek tragic authors would become increasingly important his models by the middle of the 17th century. Important models were also supplied by the Spanish Golden Age playwrights Pedro Calderón de la Barca, Tirso de Molina and Lope de Vega, many of whose works were translated and adapted for the French stage. Greek tragedy was not the first written in the English language. The most famous and most successful tragedies are those of William Shakespeare and his Elizabethan contemporaries. Shakespeare's tragedies include Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, King Lear, Macbeth, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Timon of Athens, Titus Andronicus. A contemporary of Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, also wrote examples of tragedy in English, notably, The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine the Great. John Webster also wrote famous plays of the genre, The Duchess of Malfi, The White Devil. Opera's tragedy contemporary with Shakespeare, an entirely different approach to facilitating the rebirth of tragedy was taken in Italy. Jacopo Peri, in the preface to his Eurydice, refers to the ancient Greeks and Romans. The attempts of Peri and his contemporaries to recreate ancient tragedy gave rise to the new Italian musical genre of opera. In France, tragic operatic works from the time of Lully to about that of Gluck were not called opera, but tragédienne musique or some similar name. The tragédienne musique is regarded as a distinct musical genre. Some later operatic composers have also shared Peri's aims. Richard Wagner's concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, for example, was intended as a return to the ideal of Greek tragedy in which all the arts were blended in service of the drama. Nietzsche, in his The Birth of Tragedy, was to support Wagner in his claims to be a successor of the ancient dramatists. Neoclassical tragedy. For much of the 17th century, Pierre Corneille, who made his mark on the world of tragedy with plays like Médée and Le Cid, was the most successful writer of French tragedies. Corneille's tragedies were strangely untragic, for they had happy endings. In his theoretical works on theatre, Corneille redefined both comedy and tragedy around the following suppositions. The stage, in both comedy and tragedy, should feature noble characters. Noble characters should not be depicted as vile. Tragedy deals with affairs of the state. Comedy deals with love. For a work to be tragic, it need not have a tragic ending. Although Aristotle says that catharsis should be the goal of tragedy, this is only an ideal. In conformity with the moral codes of the period, plays should not show evil being rewarded or nobility being degraded. Corneille continued to write plays through 1674 and many continued to be successes. Although the irregularities of his theatrical methods were increasingly criticized and the success of Jean Racine from the late 1660s signaled the end of his preeminence. Jean Racine's tragedies, inspired by Greek myths, Euripides, Sophocles and Seneca, condensed their plot into a tight set of passionate and duty-bound conflicts between a small group of noble characters, and concentrated on these characters' double binds and the geometry of their unfulfilled desires and hatreds. Racine's poetic skill was in the representation of pathos and amorous passion, and his impact was such that emotional crisis would be the dominant mode of tragedy to the end of the century. Racine's two late plays opened new doors to biblical subject matter and to the use of theatre in the education of young women. Racine also faced criticism for his irregularities. When his play, Berenice, was criticized for not containing any deaths, Racine disputed the conventional view of tragedy. For more on French tragedy of the 16th and 17th centuries, see French Renaissance literature and French literature of the 17th century. Bourgeois tragedy. Bourgeois tragedy is a form that developed in 18th-century Europe. It was a fruit of the Enlightenment and the emergence of the bourgeois class and its ideals. It is characterized by the fact that its protagonists are ordinary citizens. The first true bourgeois tragedy was an English play, George Lillo's The London Merchant, or The History of George Barnwell, which was first performed in 1731. Usually, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing's play Miss Sarah Sampson, which was first produced in 1755, is said to be the earliest Bürgerliches Trauerspiel in Germany.